Hello, listeners. This is your host, Maggie Downs, of the podcast titled Sustainable. This podcast is dedicated to climate change issues and solutions which anyone and everyone can take to combat global warming and our climate crisis that is currently happening on our Earth. We will discuss what the real issues to climate change are, and more importantly, what the average person can do to help make a difference. In this episode, we will begin discussing what climate change is all about, who it really is that is hurting our planet, and why we, sometimes unknowingly, take part in it.
Welcome to today's episode of Sustainable, where I and an expert on climate change will be discussing climate injustice. To begin, let's learn a little bit about our main topic. Climate change poses a threat to all humans in regard to their health and well-being, not only today, but for years to come. Some people, though, face greater risks when it comes to climate change. Socially and economically disadvantaged people are much more vulnerable to the effects of climate change, specifically due to their location, access to resources, and income. One topic in climate science that ultimately relates to a social/racial injustice is rising temperatures due to greenhouse gases. Disadvantaged communities are more inclined to face the effects of climate change in this sense than those living in more privileged areas. So I was reading a little bit about this topic, and I came across this really interesting blog post coming out of Columbia University called State of the Planet: Why Climate Change is an Environmental Justice Issue. Our planet is experiencing far warmer temperatures than we have ever seen, which leads to more death and illness, as well as stroke, exhaustion, hypothermia, and dehydration. I found this quote from the blog that states, "Disadvantaged communities have higher rates of health conditions as well as heart disease, diabetes, asthma, and chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, which is also known as COPD." So this, to me, strikes the question, why are those who are socially and economically disadvantaged affected more by rising temperatures than those who are living in more affluent or, say, wealthy communities? I have found that there are many different answers to that question. According to that same Columbia University article or blog post, African Americans are 3 times more likely than white Americans to live in inferior housing with poor insulation and no air conditioning, therefore susceptible to a rising heat. Another great quote from this article I found states the following: "In addition, low-income areas in cities that have been found to be 5 to 12 degrees hotter than higher income neighborhoods because they have fewer trees and parks and more asphalt that retains heat." Scientists have been predicting this impact on the world's poorest and most vulnerable individuals for years, and research is suggesting now that this impact may have actually been happening for years. Time magazine has this fantastic article that I think everyone should really read or find the time to read. The article is titled, "Climate Change has already increased global inequality, and it will only get worse." In this article, it talks about how some scientists have been doing research and studies that are showing that global warming has been negatively affecting disadvantaged communities for a while now. A study that was used in this article begins to explain this research more in depth. So I have a direct quote here from this article that I think will explain what I've been trying to say a little bit better. "A study published Monday in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Science found that in the most poor communities, higher temperatures are more than 90% likely to have resulted in decreased economic output compared to a world without global warming. Meanwhile, the effect has been less dramatic in the wealthier nations, with some even potentially benefiting from these higher temperatures." So obviously it's unfair to see that climate change is affecting humans disproportionately, but this is just all the more reason why we need to take action for the sake of those who aren't as privileged as some of us, especially those in the United States versus other poor countries in general. We've come to realize that overall, climate change disproportionately harms certain groups of people more than others. And I think that we as a society should find the need to collectively do our part to reduce the effects of climate change, which I will be talking about with my guest of what are some ways that we can prevent climate change or do our part to help combat climate change, especially for these communities that it is affecting even more than wealthier or affluent communities. Because just because you specifically might not feel the effects of this, it might be affecting someone else who's less privileged than you are. And come 10 years from now, you might be feeling those effects that people today are feeling. And those people today will be feeling it even more years to come in the future. So, here with me today, I have Miss Juliana Carletti, who is currently studying climate science at Monmouth University. Juliana is a third-year student who has mastered the subject of climate change and climate justices that I've briefly talked about before, earlier in this episode. I will be asking Juliana a couple of questions about climate justices and well as climate injustices, since she is an expert in this field and she knows a lot about the subject at hand, not only about climate science in general, but specifically what I'm trying to target today about these certain communities that are hit harder from climate change just simply because of their demographic. So, Juliana, thank you so much for being on today. And my first question to you is, can you briefly explain to us how climate change can impact our social conditions for those who are in low-income communities?
Yes, and first I would like to thank you for having me speak on this important topic today. It's such an honor. To begin, low-income communities are not the only people who are suffering with climate change. People of color, those who are disabled, very old or very young people, and even women, they are all more susceptible to risks posed by climate change than those who are more fortunate. These risks can include storms, hurricanes, floods, poor air quality, or even severe heat. These communities are more inclined to feel the effects of climate change more harshly than other communities for a number of reasons.
Yeah, that's a really good point. But next, could you go into more detail explaining why these communities are more vulnerable?
Yes, of course. I have learned throughout my classes and from professors that communities of color are more likely to be at risk of air pollution. People that live on a limited income may not have the funds to prepare for storms caused by climate change, and people who don't speak English as a first language could be at risk of not knowing information about weather inclement and such.
That is very interesting. I think so many people just do not understand that these minorities are at more of a risk of health issues and the effects of climate change than the more wealthy side of the world.
Yes, it is very important that we educate ourselves on topics like this one, because most of the world probably has no idea that others suffer more than them when it comes to climate change and climate justice.
So this actually leads to my next point that I wanted to talk to you about. So my next question for you, do you know of anything that can be done or already is being done to help these certain communities when natural disasters like hurricanes, floods, or even extreme heat occurs?
There are some organizations that are doing a lot to help these people. One organization you can support is the Climate Justice Alliance, who advocates for gender, race, and class in climate action discussions. Also, the UN and IPCC are promoting for civil rights and justice in the environmental side of things. Ultimately, nothing will change without government involvement, so using our vote helps more than you think. President Joe Biden has shown his support for environmental justice and a fair economic opportunity for a future in clean air and energy, which will trickle down to help poor communities and those at higher risks.
Well, I honestly just wanted to thank you so much for speaking on this topic today because you seem to be very knowledgeable about this subject and you seem to know quite a lot about the topic that I did want to tackle today, not only about climate change, but the climate injustices.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. Hopefully I'll be back soon.
I also wanted to just give a big thank you to everyone for listening today, and I really hope you learned something new. Check out my next episode when I talk about the more political/business side of environmental science and climate change and how government support is massively important. So I'll see you next time. Thank you so much.